Hello friends and neighbors. Well, if you have been watching my channel for a while now, then you know that I have been stuck in this series that I started several years ago called the Favorite Book Series. And more specifically, I have been stuck in the middle of a series in that series called the Incarnation of Immortality series. There's a lot of series going on. So far, I have looked at 4 of the 7 books in the Incarnations of Immortality series by Piers, and today I decided, you know what? I'm just gonna finish it. I finished rereading it, and so now I'm just gonna finish with reviewing. So today, we are going to look at books 5, 6, and 7 in the Incarnations of Immortality series all at once. I'm still going to look at the 3 books separately, but I'm going to do it all in one video, and hopefully the video won't be, like, ridiculously long. So, today, join me as I look at the last 3 books in the Incarnations of Immortality series, otherwise known as the good, the bad, and the First, a recap of the series so far. Book 1, On a Pale Horse, looked at the Incarnation of Death and is thus far the best book in the series. Book 2, Bearing an Hourglass, looked at the Incarnation of Time and is thus far the worst book in the series. Book 3, with the Tangled Skein, looked at the Incarnation of Fate and is pretty good for the most part. And Book 4, Wielding a Red Sword, looked at the Incarnation of War and is pretty bad for the most part. So a very, very mixed series, and now we are turning to Book 5, which was originally supposed to be the last book in the series, the conclusion of the series, and looks at the Incarnation of Nature, who up until this point has been a very, very mysterious figure. The Incarnation of Nature seems to be a step above the other incarnations. She has a tremendous amount of power over all of nature, and even she seems to be able to hold power over the incarnations. Like, technically the incarnations are supremely powerful in their own field, but even the Incarnation of Nature seems to be able to manipulate the other incarnations in some way. Also significant is the fact that the protagonist of this book is Orb, a character who we have already met in the previous novels. I mean, technically I guess we met some of the other characters, but we didn't know them by name. Orb we have actually met by name. She is the daughter of the protagonist from Book 3, Niobe, and the former lover of the protagonist from Book 4, Mim, and she's also related to a couple of characters from the first 2 books as well, so she has connections to a lot of the other incarnations and characters from the series. So we have what was supposed to be the original conclusion to the series, an interesting and mysterious incarnation, and a character who we've already met and come to like. So, how did this book stack up? Being a Green Mother, it's not a bad book. It's not a good book either, but, you know, it's there. It exists. There are definitely aspects of this story that I like. In particular, I like the setup and about the first third of the book. Now, this book is a little bit of a departure from the structure that we've seen in the first 4 books. In the first 4 books, we get to spend a little bit of time with the mortal character who will eventually become the Incarnation, learning about what their life is like and so on. Then they become the Incarnation and they have to learn the rules and how to do the job and all that sort of thing. And then in the last third of the novel, that's where the plot kicks in and they have to battle Satan and all that sort of thing. But in this book, Orb actually doesn't become the Incarnation of Nature until about the last third of the novel. Up until then, she's just Orb and actually doesn't have a whole lot of contact with the incarnations outside of, you know, her own family. But let's back up and talk about Orb a little bit. Orb is a musician. She sings and she plays the harp, and she's actually very, very good at it. Not just because she's just naturally talented, but also because she has a particular magic that operates anytime she sings and plays. She's also specially attuned to a particular piece of music which is known as the Yano, and I don't know if that's how you actually pronounce it, but that's how I'm going to pronounce it. The Yano is basically the song of the universe. Basically, think if the Force from Star Wars was a piece of music. That's what the Yano is really supposed to be. And if it's wielded by the right person, i.e. somebody with magic related to music, then it can do, well, honestly, pretty much anything. And so Orb spends the first 2/3 of the novel, ostensibly, looking for the Yano, trying to learn different aspects of it in the hopes of being able to discover this great song. It's not even that she wants to wield the power of the Yano specifically, she just wants to know it. She's just curious. But as she starts to learn aspects of the Yano, we learn eventually in the novel that she is actually learning the office of the Incarnation of Nature. And that's actually kind of cool. All of the incarnations come to their offices in different ways, but always in some way related to the office. Like death has to kill the previous office holder. War becomes the incarnation of war when there's a war brewing after there's been peace. That sort of thing. And so it makes sense for Orb to become the incarnation of nature because she's just kind of naturally attuned to it. And I also like the idea of the Yano, the idea of there being this song that has this great magic and is basically the song of the universe. It's when Piers Anthony starts to get into specifics that it bugs me. Because Piers Anthony has this really bad habit of taking this thing that should be very mysterious and very interesting in its mystery and just making it way too technical. And that's the problem both with the Yano and with the Incarnation of Nature, the office itself. It's simultaneously too technical and too vague to be interesting. And it started to get really tiresome just to read portions where it was just like, she sang this theme to do this specific thing, and then she sang a slightly different theme to do this specific thing. Like, the Yano basically became the Deus Ex Machina that could do anything. The other aspect of Orb's character that the story revolves around is a prophecy that was actually made in Book 3, that Orb would eventually marry Satan, or at least she might marry Satan. It's not really clear. Now, prophecies fulfilling themselves is another common Piers Anthony trope, but it's actually something that he usually does pretty well. And again, the setup for this is really interesting. Satan has been portrayed as the antagonist, the pure evil character for the previous 4 novels. The idea that he could be someone who is capable of love is interesting. The idea that somebody could come to love him in return is interesting. The idea that he would be able to play the part of being a loving person to somebody to the extent that he would fool everybody is interesting. The execution, however, was lacking. It was basically the equivalent of it was all a dream. I'm not going to get into specifics here, but that's essentially what it boils down to. The plot twist of how it all came together was incredibly weak, and I would have loved to see something a little bit more clever from, you know, the Master of Lies. In general, I seem to like the idea of this story rather than the story itself, and I think the place where it really starts to get bogged down for me is about a third of the way through the novel when Orb joins a band called the Livin' Sludge, who we actually met in Book 1. Up until then, it's basically just Orb's journey to find the Yano, which takes her all over the world and has her meeting interesting people, and really gives us a pretty good insight into the real world outside of the world of the incarnations. But then she decides, for whatever reason, to join this band made up of drug addicts. Because she wants to cure them? Nah. And like I said, they're drug addicts, and Piers Anthony writes with one particular voice. It's presumably the voice that he actually uses. He doesn't do so well writing in other voices, particularly people who are street. So watching him try to write these hardened, cynical drug addicts in a band that plays generic rock music, presumably, is really kind of awkward. Also, Piers Anthony seems to think that he knows more about music than he actually does, and so watching him try to describe the music that's being played and anything musical at all in this book that is pretty much saturated with music makes the musician in me cringe. And the band members are so generic, they don't even have names. They're referred to throughout the entire book as the drummer, the guitarist, the organist. First of all, organist? Really? Keyboardist. Second of all, what self-respecting rock band doesn't have a bassist? And third, how hard would it have been to give them names? You're Tom, you're Dick, you're Harry. Done. So throughout this series, we've been talking about the balance between idea, character, and plot, and all 3 of them have really, really good setup here. You've got the idea of the Yano and the various prophecy with Satan and so on, you've got the character of Orb, and you've got the conclusion to the series, or what was originally supposed to be the conclusion to the series. And all 3 of them just fall absolutely flat because the plot gets bogged down, the character stops developing, and the ideas just become way too technical to be interesting. I liked the first third of the novel, and I liked the very, very end, but ultimately it seemed like the entire book was just a setup for the last chapter, and that's no way to write a book. It had a lot of promise, but ultimately it just fell flat, and on the worth meter this one gets a worth skimming. But let's now move on to book 6 in the series, which was supposed to only have been 5 books, For Love of Evil, following the incarnation of, well, evil. First, a little bit of background. How did a 5-book series become a 7-book series? There was actually a lot of space between book 5 and book 6, and during that time, Piers Anthony switched publishers. At the time, his 3 best-known series were Xanth, the Apprentice Adept series, and the Incarnation of Immortality series, all 3 of which, by the way, are on the favorites list. And he had introduced all 3 of those under Del Rey Publishing, who he had basically started his career with. But at this point in his career, he switched over to Ace Publishing. And under this new publisher, all 3 series got a facelift. Obviously, we'll talk more about the facelift that Xanth and the Apprentice Adept series got when we review those books, but for the Incarnation of Immortality series, Piers Anthony decided to extend the original series and publish 2 new books looking at the incarnations of evil and good. Hence we have For Love of Evil, which I don't think by any coincidence comes the closest to finding that balance between idea, character, and plot. On a Pale Horse is the best book of the original 5 because that's the book he had to use to sell the series to his publishers, and For Love of Evil is the next best book because this is the book he had to use to sell to his new publishers. In many ways, this book reads like the first book of a series, and Piers Anthony actually stated in the author's note of this book that he wanted to make sure that this book appealed both to fans of the original 5 books and newcomers to the series. And so this book actually goes back farther than the original series ever goes. It takes us back to the 11th century and introduces us to a character named Perry, who, of course, we know is eventually going to become the character we know as Satan from the first 5 books. But of course, he doesn't start out that way. In the beginning of this story, he is a young sorcerer's apprentice looking for a wife in a young girl named Jolie. This is a nice carryover from book 5 of the series, where we learn that Satan is in fact a creature capable of loving another person. Here we see the original mortal who eventually became evil, and we watch his journey as he eventually becomes the incarnation of evil. And that journey is a really interesting one because it shows us a lot of the very fluid definitions between what is good and what is evil. And just as we see Orb in book 5 using the Yano to learn how to perform the office of the Incarnation of Nature, in this book we really do see Perry learning how to be the incarnation of evil, even though he's not doing what one might consider evil things. In fact, throughout the first third of the novel, he's doing what he believes to be the work of God, and what a lot of other people believe to be the work of God too. But some of the methods that he is using to do that really border on the sort of things that he does as the incarnation of evil. In particular, deception. Satan, of course, is the father of lies, and he uses lies and deception in a lot of his schemes. And we see him learning to do those things. For instance, he is a sorcerer, and sorcery is kind of based in deception. And there is a moment of corruption, like there is a single thing that he does that leads to his eventual corruption to becoming the incarnation of evil, and it's really, really obvious what that is. But even before that moment comes, there are definitely aspects of what he is doing that might in some context be considered evil. Because evil is a very subjective thing, and one of the things that this novel does really quite well is explore the nature of evil and what is considered good and what is considered evil and how we come to these conclusions. The book also gets into the very conflicting roles of the character of Satan. On the one hand, he's supposed to be the embodiment of evil, the antithesis of everything good, but on the other hand, he's also the master of hell, and he's supposed to be responsible for punishing evil and punishing the evil people that come into hell. And these two things seem to conflict each other. And the character of Perry himself struggles with this and eventually comes to the conclusion that he and God should be working together in order to sort out the good souls from the evil souls. Unfortunately, as has been indicated throughout the entire series, the incarnation of evil is really the only one doing anything, and we don't get actual confirmation in the first 5 books that the incarnation of good is just not doing anything. It's just kind of explained away as, oh, he's just honoring a covenant of non-interference. But in this book, we get confirmation that, yeah, the incarnation of good is pretty much just sitting on his ass and doing nothing. And the idea that God is essentially ignoring us is one that resonates with a lot of people, especially people who see all the evil in the world and wonder, how can an all-powerful being just stand by and watch all this evil happen and do nothing and still be considered the embodiment of good. And of course, in exploring the nature of good and evil, we're also exploring the character of Perry himself and how he comes to this place in his life where he becomes the incarnation of evil, and how even though he is the incarnation of evil, there is still some good in him and a desire to do the right thing. So obviously idea and character are done really well in this book, and honestly those are the two things that really matter to me with this series, but plot does kind of fall apart in this one. It falls flat a little bit, especially as we get into the last third of the book. Up until then, there really isn't much of a plot. We're just seeing the story of Perry's life and then the story of the incarnation of evil as he learns how to do the office, just like the other books. And because of the nature of the book, it's okay that there's not much of a plot here because we're just exploring different aspects of evil, just like we explore different aspects of death in On a Pale Horse. But in the last third of the book, we get into the events that we actually already witnessed in the previous 5 books in the series from Satan's point of view. And Piers Anthony was obviously really afraid that the people who had read the previous 5 books in the series were going to find this section boring. He really wanted to make sure that he was appealing to the people who had read the books before. But that's not actually the problem. The problem is that these scenes are way too rushed. Like, they feel obligatory. It feels like he's just kind of speeding his way through it to get to the present day where we left off in book 5. And it all kind of comes together really awkwardly. It still doesn't really have much of a through line, much of a plot, other than this is the story of the incarnation of evil. And it just never seems to come together in a really satisfying way. It wasn't as much of a slog to get through as some of the other stuff that Piers Anthony has written by any stretch of the imagination, but it still wasn't my favorite part of the book to read. However, it is worth pointing out that most of the problems with this section of the book are the same problems I had with the previous 5 books in the series. And after reading 2 books that were really kind of meh, this book was a really refreshing change of pace. Like, I actually looked forward to sitting down and continuing reading it. The character was interesting, the ideas were interesting, the plot was so-so, but you know, honestly, that's okay. A few flaws, but overall very enjoyable and thought-provoking, and on the worth meter, I would give this one a worth owning used. And finally, we get to the last book in the series. Yes, I know, he published an 8th book, but we're going to ignore it because it was pointless, and he wrapped up the story in book 7, so whatever. The last book in the series, looking at the incarnation of good and eternity. So going into this, I was trying to remember anything about this book, and I really couldn't come up with much of anything that I could remember. I knew it was about the incarnation of good. I knew that the plot focused around 3 characters, Jolie, who we met in book 6, Orlean, who we met in book 2, and a new character named Vita, who is another really, really awkward attempt at Piers Anthony to write a character who is street. I knew that much of the plot centered around them finding a replacement for the incarnation of good, who, as previously mentioned, is not paying any attention to anything anymore. I remembered who they eventually chose for the incarnation of good, and I remembered enjoying the ending of the book and the series. And I remembered that at some point there was a debate between creationism and evolution for some reason that I couldn't remember. And when trying to remember how I enjoyed each of these books, I remembered this one being right in the middle. I remembered enjoying books 1, 6, and 3. I remembered feeling kind of lukewarm towards 5, 4, and 2, and this one was somewhere in that middle region. So I figured, you know, at worst this will be just kind of another meh book like Being a Green Mother, and you know, I might not enjoy it very much, but it can't be any worse than Bearing an Hourglass. Oh boy, was I wrong. Alright, settle in, this is going to take a while. So, let's start with the 2 most infuriating things about this book, because they really do kind of sum up my feelings about this book. And before I get into talking about these 2 things, I actually have to put a trigger warning at the start of this particular part of the review, because I am going to be talking about rape and creepy sex things. So if that's the sort of thing you think is going to trigger you and you don't want any part of that, then you can stop watching now, and I'll put a link to a time period where I'm going to stop talking about this and just talk about the series in general. So like I said, the book focuses around 3 characters, 2 of whom are dead and actually ghosts, and are inhabiting the body of the 3rd. Orlean and Jolie are the 2 ghosts, and they have work that they need to do in the mortal world, and so they inhabit the body of Vita, who is a 15-year-old prostitute and drug addict, and we'll get more into her character in a little bit. But what Orlean wants out of her afterlife is to find the soul of her son who died due to a genetic malady. She wants to make sure that he goes to heaven like he's supposed to, but unfortunately he has been kidnapped. His soul, rather, has been kidnapped by the Incarnation of Night. And if you don't recognize the Incarnation of Night, it's just as well because she's pretty much just a pointless sex thing. At the beginning of the book, while she's just starting her journey, Orlean, for reasons I'm not going to get into because they really don't matter, gets turned slowly into a man. And as she becomes more and more male, she also gets more and more aggressive and eventually gets to the point where she tries to rape her companion, who is Jolie. The explanation here is that men, of course, are just naturally sexual animals with voracious sexual appetites, and the only reason that we don't go around just randomly raping women on the street is because we've learned how to curb those impulses. Okay. I know that Piers Anthony did not intend to say this based on other things of his that I've written, but he basically just excused every single rapist who has used the excuse of, oh, I just couldn't control myself. He just made that a perfectly valid justification for rape. And again, I know that wasn't what he meant to do, but regardless, it's what he did. But believe it or not, that's not even the most infuriating thing about this book. No, not by a long shot. So I already mentioned Vida, who is a 15-year-old girl who has been forced into prostitution, sexually abused, and is addicted to drugs. Eventually, she comes under the protection of a judge whose name is Roke, I think. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. I don't know if that's actually how it's supposed to be pronounced, but we're going to pronounce it Roke. And he is described as middle-aged, which means at the youngest he is 40. Now, because he is her rescuer, Vida feels a certain amount of affection for him. That just makes sense. And she even starts to feel sexual attraction towards him. And that also kind of makes sense because she has been sexually abused by father figures in the past. She's been sexually abused repeatedly as a prostitute, and this is a nice man who has come to rescue her. So it makes sense that she would kind of have some confusion about affection versus sexual attraction. That sexual attraction is reciprocated by the middle-aged judge, and they start a fully sexual relationship, which is described in great detail. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that this relationship is treated by every character in the book as true love. The rationale here is that they both want the relationship, and age is just an arbitrary number, and she's mature enough to handle it because she's had all these experiences and she's had sex before, and so she can totally handle it, which, come to think of it, is the same sort of argument a 15-year-old girl would make for dating a 40-year-old man. Okay, I surely do not need to explain why this is so incredibly fucked up. And yes, I use the word fuck in a review. That's how pissed off I am about this. The age of consent exists for a reason. Yes, it's an arbitrary number. It has to be. The only alternative is judging each case subjectively. And Vida's experiences of rape and prostitution, far from being a justification of the relationship, are all the more reason why you should not be taking advantage of this confused girl. And it's not just that he's reluctantly engaging in a sexual relationship with this girl that wants him. No, he enjoys it. He gets off on it. This isn't true love. This is a Jerry Springer segment. And here's the really irritating thing about both of these things that I've talked about. They're completely unnecessary. There was no reason for there to be a rape at the beginning of the book. There was no reason for the relationship between Vida and Roke to be sexual. It would have worked perfectly well. In fact, I would argue it would have worked better as a father-daughter relationship. But Piers Anthony has to make everything sexual. Everything. It's one of the more infuriating aspects of being a fan of this man. And he made these so firmly a part of the main plot of the book that you cannot separate them. You cannot lose sight of these two aspects. They are everywhere. Every time you think, oh, I'm actually starting to enjoy this book, there'd be another mention of it and I just get pissed off all over again. Honestly, I don't even feel like I need to talk about the rest of the book because how can you redeem yourself after that? How do you come back from that? But I am going to talk about the rest of the book because the rest of the book did not redeem itself. It basically just devolved into a video game plot where Orlean visited each of the incarnations in turn and got something, collected something so that she could rescue the soul of her baby. It became really plotting and didn't really give us any insight into the incarnations that we didn't already get from the previous 6 books. Death is hard. Oh. Okay. And there is a little bit of the idea aspect too. He continues to look at the nature of good and evil, but instead of looking at it more objectively like he did in book 6, here he turns to preaching. At one point there is a random debate, as I mentioned before, between creationism and evolution, which doesn't really have a place, but okay, whatever, let's have a debate. And this is a little bit of an infuriating thing too, although for this one I will give Piers Anthony the benefit of the doubt because I understand what he's trying to do. He's trying to ultimately make the argument that the debate between creationism and evolution is pointless, but unfortunately he's going about it the wrong way. The reason why it's pointless to debate these things is because they're two completely different things. It's a belief versus a scientific fact. But the stance that he takes is rather that they are two different perspectives. So he basically makes evolution into a belief, which is exactly the argument that creationists keep using in order to push their own agenda. Again, that's not what he meant to do, and I get that, but that's nonetheless what he did. The only part of the book that really started to redeem itself was towards the end, when it was finally revealed that what we were looking for all along was a replacement for the Incarnation of Good. We learned in book 6 that the Incarnation of Good, or God, has become so enamored with himself and his own power and glory that he has stopped paying attention to the mortal world. And so the other incarnations decide to go about the business of replacing him, which involves, first of all, having the mortal Senate, I guess, vote for his impeachment, because it's a political office now, I guess, and then having the incarnations unanimously choose a replacement. How is this not your story? How do you have such a provocative, interesting, thoughtful idea and relegate it to the last fourth of the novel and spend the rest of the time on this creepy-ass sex story and this stupid plotting video game plot? How do you do that? My apologies. The only part of the book that I liked was the last chapter, where they actually make the decision of who is going to be the replacement for the Incarnation of Good. That part I liked, and as I was reading it, it almost made me feel good enough that I could forget the rest of the book. I almost considered giving this book a higher rating just for that last chapter alone, because it was that good a conclusion. But I ultimately decided that the ends in this case absolutely do not justify the means. And so for the first time ever in a review on this channel, not in a review personally, but in a review on this channel, I am giving a book the less than worthless rating. It was that bad. So having gone through all of that, what is my conclusion on the Incarnations of Immortality series as a whole? Well, obviously you can't have a book in the series that gets a less than worthless rating and still be on the favorites list. That's just common sense. So the series as a whole obviously is not on the favorites list anymore. However, I have decided that I am going to keep On a Pale Horse on the favorites list because it is by far the best book in the series. It's still, in my opinion, a really, really good book, and you don't really need the rest of the series after reading this. This book stands alone. I would put For Love of Evil on the favorites list as well, but unfortunately because of that last third of the book, it also kind of fell short of the favorites list. It's a book that I would be willing to read again on its own without the rest of the series and still probably enjoy, but I still can't honestly call it a favorite. So that does it for the Incarnations of Immortality series, a very, very mixed series that is no longer on the favorites list, but for the first book. And what am I going to read next? I have no idea. I've got a few things that I'm reading right now. All of them are series, and you'll find out when I pop up with the next review, whenever that might be. So, until next time, friends and neighbors. But I feel like that's an awfully big assumption. Excuse me. I did the initial analysis on Deus. Maybe if I look back over my
You two aren't
notes, I
supposed to
can...
be together. What are you talking about?
Nothing. Just chatting.
Chatting's what got you into trouble last time.